I'm in southern Israel right now, and as you can see, I'm inside of a bomb shelter in Sderot city that has been targeted by rocket fire from Gaza. Over half of Israel's population ran to bomb shelters tonight. Why? Because terrorist organizations in Gaza, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, have been launching hundreds of rockets towards Israel, including Tel Aviv, including our Ben Gurion airport. This school in Ashkelon was hit by a rocket. And this is a home in southern Israel that was completely destroyed. These terrorists fired over 500 rockets towards Israel. Who are they targeting? Civilians. Are you listening? Civilians. Where is the UN? Where are the human rights organizations? Why are they silent? Where is the outrage? Hamas is using people in Gaza as human shields. They fire their rockets from civilian populations because they want Israel to strike civilian populations in Gaza. They want to use that for their propaganda. I'm sure that you have seen photos and videos of injured children in Gaza over the past few days, and actually 1/3 of the rockets that were fired from Gaza towards Israel did not even make it to Israel and landed in Gaza, causing all these injuries to its very own people. But of course, they don't care if their own people get hurt as long as they can blame it on us. And when you see the media using titles like Israel is bombing Gaza, know that we don't bomb Gaza. We specifically target terror targets in Gaza. We specifically eliminate terrorists, not civilians. And by the way, do you know how Gazans always know when to film a terror target right before Israel strikes it? Well, it's called roof knocking. The Israeli Air Force is dropping a non-explosive device on the target before actually bombing it to let the civilians in that area leave the place. Listen, we are not dealing with reasonable people. We are dealing with a terrorist organization that proudly declares its ambition to destroy Israel, to destroy our people. This is what the skies looked like over Tel Aviv tonight. Now, what if it was rockets above your city, your town, or your community? This is unacceptable, and Israel has every right to defend its people. It's not just a right, but an obligation. And this is the truth. And I ask you to share this video. You have the power to let the world know what's going on in Israel by simply sharing the truth, because together we are stronger.
It's a very sobering thought that hypersonic weapons, for the most part, cannot be defended against right now. You could certainly see a launch of a missile booster rocket carrying a hypersonic weapon, but once that weapon, say it's a glider, releases from the rocket, you lose track of it. Currently, there are 3 countries that are vying for the lead in hypersonic weapons development: China, Russia, and the United States. Let me start by talking about China. They recently tested a hypersonic weapon called the Xingkong 2. It's a hypersonic cruise missile. This weapon was released from a rocket high over the sky of northeastern China. It then glided through the atmosphere, going at Mach 6 times the speed of sound, bobbing and weaving, riding the shock waves that it was emitting. Another variety that China is pursuing is called the Dongfeng 17 East Wind. It is a hypersonic glide vehicle. What's important is that it just doesn't simply release and glide to a target. It can be maneuvered, and that maneuverability at such high speed is what these countries really prize about hypersonic weapons. Russia tested what's called the Avangard. And the Avangard is a hypersonic glide vehicle. According to the Russian sources, they claim that this hypersonic glide vehicle glided 6,000 kilometers across the country to the Far East, the Kamchatka Peninsula, traveling upwards of Mach 27. So that's amazingly, blazingly fast speed. The United States, also very long-standing interest in hypersonics. They have several programs in active testing now. All branches of the military are pursuing hypersonic weapons, both the glide vehicles and the cruise missiles. The hypersonic cruise missiles, they are called air-breathing, so they propel themselves through the air. Now, I should say that these hypersonic cruise missiles, for the most part, they are released at high speed from either a booster missile or from a jet. When they're released, they're traveling pretty fast, but then they propel themselves using what's called a scramjet engine. It's basically a tube where the air comes in, fuel's injected, they mix, combust, and that provides propulsion. Scramjet engines have also been described to me as the most challenging engine to get to work because of the extreme conditions that they're operating under. And the reason is when air is moving so fast at hypersonic speed into this tube, molecules have fractions of milliseconds to mix with the air. There are other problems as well, and that has to do with the boundary layer of air that the vehicle is traveling through at hypersonic speed. This boundary layer actually thickens the faster you go at hypersonic speed. And in this very complex kind of physical environment, turbulence causes spikes in temperature. And the spikes in temperature can heat up the skin of the vehicle to very high temperatures. Traveling at very high hypersonic speeds, high Mach numbers, air around the vehicle ionizes to the extent that radio signals have trouble getting through. So let's say these hypersonic gliders that can go upwards of Mach 25, 27, you would have this problem communicating with them. Testing vehicles at these hypersonic speeds, it's extremely expensive. So there's been very limited testing, and because there's been limited testing, you have a pretty patchy success rate. Russia's already deploying hypersonics. They beat the US to the punch in that way. It really is a competitive space race in a way.
The US Defense Secretary Mark Esper has taken part in a classified exercise to determine how Washington would respond to a Russian nuclear attack in Europe, according to officials.
The scenario included a European contingency, where you are conducting a war with Russia, and Russia decides to use a low-yield limited nuclear weapon against a site on NATO territory. And then you go through the conversation that you would have with the Secretary of Defense, and then with the President, ultimately to decide how to respond. We simulated responding with a nuclear weapon.
Well, the exercises come as the US seeks to upgrade its nuclear capabilities. Earlier this month, the Department of Defense requested a military budget of over $740 billion for 2021. It said it wants an additional $4 billion for nuclear weapons spending. That's a 19% increase on the current budget. Russia's condemned what it says amounts to Washington's undermining of global stability.
We condemn such actions because, firstly, they clearly demonstrate Washington's readiness to follow the path of confrontation and further lower the threshold for using nuclear weapons. Instead of focusing on efforts to strengthen the arms control system, including the nuclear system, the United States is playing an extremely dangerous game.
Well, let's go live now to Peter Kuznick, a professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. Sir, thanks for joining us. Good to have you on today. I mean, this is something you would expect in a Cold War era scenario, isn't it? I mean, just how common is it for the military to practice these sorts of games, these sorts of scenarios?
Well, these kinds of war games are actually pretty common. They conduct them on a regular basis. But what's different now is the climate. The relations between the United States and Russia are very, very shaky right now. It was very recently, that the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved the hands of the doomsday clock to 100 seconds before midnight. That's the closest it's ever been. Right, in January of 2018, they moved it to 2 minutes before midnight. The last time they had done that was back in 1953 after the United States and the Soviet Union tested their hydrogen bombs. The fact that they moved it so close again is a reflection of just how precarious the global situation is now. In this exercise that you were mentioning, the situation is, the belief is that if there was a war between Russia and NATO, that NATO would have some conventional advantage and that Russia would respond with a tactical nuclear weapon. It's called a strategy of escalating to de-escalate. That would show NATO how serious Russia was and would hopefully deter further attack. And there are two possibilities. NATO could respond with conventional weapons, or it could respond with nuclear weapons. Over the years, they've simulated this kind of nuclear war, limited nuclear war, many times. What usually happens is that it escalates out of control. There is almost no scenario in which a limited nuclear war ends after each side shoots off one nuclear weapon. The much more likely scenario is that it continues to escalate, and then we're all finished.
Russia and America, obviously, they're not the only nuclear powers, and you mentioned quite rightly the doomsday clock, they're moving towards midnight. Is that because of this movement towards deploying so-called low-yield nuclear weapons, where something that was perhaps totally unmanageable in previous decades is now potentially a reality?
It has something to do with the low-yield nuclear weapons, but even beyond that, the situation is quite unstable right now. There's very little trust between the United States and Russia. We're dismantling our entire nuclear architecture. It began in 2002 when the U.S. announced it was doing away with the ABM treaty. It was shortly after that that Russia began developing its countermeasures. And then the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, then the INF treaty, which was abrogated. And now the only one left really that's significant is the New START treaty. And Putin has asked Trump to extend the New START treaty when it expires less than a year from now, in early February 2021, and Trump has so far not responded. Trump says he wants to have a broader treaty that includes China. China has shown no willingness at all to go along with that. You have to remember that the United States and Russia have about 93% of the world's nuclear weapons between us. China, on the other hand, has about 290 or 300 nuclear weapons. So China's nuclear policy is fundamentally different than the U.S. and the Russian nuclear policy. So China sees little interest in going along with this kind of agreement. But if the United States and Russia do not extend the New START treaty, then the danger is we go back to a 1980s-style nuclear arms race. Trump has said he welcomes a nuclear arms race. That is insanity. But that's what Trump is looking toward. And he says we're going to win a nuclear arms race. Well, maybe the United States would win a nuclear arms race, but the world loses in a nuclear arms race. You have to remember that about 1985, the world had accumulated the equivalent of 1.5 million Hiroshima bombs. 1.5 million. And there were about close to 70,000 nuclear weapons in all. So right now we're down to about 14,000, 20% of what we used to have, which is still insane. and certainly more than enough to trigger nuclear winter and end pretty much all life on the planet. But because we even know that the latest studies show that a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, which 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons were used, could kill up to 2 billion people, send 5 million tons of smoke and soot into the atmosphere, destroy agriculture. I mean, so we're not playing with toys here. We're talking about something that poses an existential threat.
Russia released a video of the joint military exercise it held with China, during which the two sides violated South Korea's air defense identification zone. The U.S. State Department responded. Washington vows to continue discouraging any attempts to destabilize the region. Yoon Jung-min has the latest.
The Russian Defense Ministry released a video clip and photos of Tuesday's joint exercise with China, along with a statement saying that the mission was aimed at developing Russia-China military cooperation and was not directed at any third country. The United States has weighed in too, sources at the State Department telling VOA that the U.S. strongly supports South Korea and its concerns about the provocative air operations. The source also said that the U.S. will continue to monitor the situation and discourage attempts to destabilize the region, calling America's commitment to the defense of its allies ironclad. Seoul's Joint Chiefs of Staff said Tuesday that a total of 19 military aircraft from Russia and China entered the air defense identification zone known as Kadets, though they said the planes did not violate South Korea's airspace. The South Korean Air Force scrambled fighter jets, as did Japan, which says some planes entered its ID zone too. Observers say the latest joint exercise by China and Russia is aimed at putting pressure on America and its allies ahead of a new U.S. administration set to start next month. In a phone conversation Tuesday with his Russian counterpart, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi condemned the U.S. for, in his words, wielding the stick of unilateral sanctions out of step with the times, and he emphasized Beijing-Moscow cooperation. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that the two countries firmly oppose what he called the undermining of multilateralism by the U.S. and that they will defend their common interests. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
在国际上搞小圈子、新冷战、排斥、威胁、恐吓他人，动不动就搞脱钩、断供、制裁，人为造成相互隔离甚至隔绝，只能把世界推向分裂甚至对抗。一个分裂的世界无法应对人类面临的共同挑战。 对抗将把人类引入死胡同。我们要坚持协商合作，不搞冲突对抗。各国历史文化和社会制度差异，不是对立对抗的理由，而是合作的动力。要尊重和包容差异，不干涉别国内政，通过协商对话解决分歧。 历史和现实一再告诉我们，当今世界如果走对立对抗的歧路，无论是搞冷战、热战，还是贸易战、科技战，最终将损害各国利益，牺牲人民福祉。我们要摒弃冷战思维、零和博弈的旧理念，坚持互尊互谅，通过战略沟通。 增进政治互信，要恪守互利共赢的。
I've known Xi Jinping for a long time. Allegedly, by the time I left office as vice president, I had spent more time with Xi Jinping than any world leader had. Doesn't have a democratic with a small d bone in his body, but he's a smart guy. He's one of the guys like Putin who thinks that autocracy is the wave of the future. Democracy can't function in an ever complex world.
Кто как обзывается, тот так и называется. И это не случайно, это не просто детская поговорочка и шутка. Вот. Смысл очень глубокий в этом, психологически. Мы всегда в другом человеке видим свои собственные качества и думаем, что он такой же, как и мы. Если кто-то воспринимает наши добрые намерения как безразличие или слабость и сам намерен окончательно сжечь или даже взорвать эти мосты, должен знать, что ответ России будет асимметричным, быстрым и жестким. Но надеюсь, что никому не придет в голову перейти в отношении России так называемую красную черту. А где она будет проходить, это мы будем определять в каждом конкретном случае сами.
Breaking tonight, Russian President Vladimir Putin telling the West to back off. This comes amid international concern over his troop buildup on the Ukraine border. Here in the U.S., one top military commander says the chances of nuclear war are actually increasing. National security correspondent Jennifer Griffin tells us about it tonight from the Pentagon.
Russian President Vladimir Putin issued a stark warning to the U.S. and NATO during his annual State of the Nation address to Parliament.
I hope that no one dares to cross the red line in respect to Russia, and we will determine where it is in each specific case.
Putin spoke as Russia continues a massive military buildup on the border with Ukraine. New satellite images show dozens of fighter jets lined up on tarmacs in southern Russia and Crimea. Top U.S. military commanders warned that new threats facing the U.S. have them seriously worried for the first time that U.S. adversaries may consider using a nuclear weapon as the, quote, least bad option. The admiral in charge of America's nuclear arsenal says it's the first time in history the U.S. has had to deter two nuclear powers at the same time, Russia and China.
I cannot deter with the leftovers of the Cold War forever into the future. That is a 70-era weapon system that I'm going to have to employ against 2030 level threats.
Some Democrats want to scrap one leg of the nuclear triad, the 400 ground-based missiles currently in silos across 3 states. The head of Strategic Command says he needs to replace, not update, those 50-year-old Minuteman III missiles. Democrats don't like the price tag.
You know, we're currently spending $44.5 billion a year on nuclear weapons. And I know that STRATCOM likes spending that money, but I don't.
The U.S. stopped keeping nuclear-capable bombers like these B-52s in Louisiana on 24-hour alert in 1991. But Admiral Richard warns if the U.S. scraps its ground-based missiles, it would have to rely too much on submarine-launched nukes.
And under those conditions, I would request to re-alert the bombers.
Putin boasted today that Russia will have modernized more than 88% of its nuclear weapons by the end of this year. Admiral Richard says the U.S. hasn't started. Brett?
Jennifer Griffin at the Pentagon. Jennifer, thank you.
Russia showed off its military might at a victory parade on Sunday. The display on Moscow's Red Square, commemorating the 76th anniversary of the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany in World War II, featured over 12,000 troops and more than 190 pieces of military hardware, including intercontinental ballistic missile launchers and a flypast by nearly 80 military aircraft. The patriotic display coincides with soaring tensions with the West, ranging from the conflict in Ukraine to the fate of jailed Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny. Russia and the US have expelled each other's diplomats in recent months, and Moscow and EU member states have been involved in a similar tit-for-tat diplomatic dispute. This year's parade also precedes parliamentary elections due to be held in September.
Just 1,000 kilometers from the North Pole, Russia is flexing its military muscle. Even at the height of the Cold War, the Nagaskoye Air Base was a remote outpost. Now, Russia's northernmost military base is a hive of activity, able to handle nuclear-capable strategic bombers. The Kremlin is projecting its power deep into the Arctic.
Ensuring peace and security in the Arctic is a major task set by the state, and it's the Northern Fleet that was put in charge of this.
NATO has also increased its military activity in the Arctic. US Air Force bombers have been training alongside Norwegian forces in recent months. The military build-up formed a tense backdrop for the Arctic Council summit Thursday in Reykjavik, as Russia took over the rotating chairmanship of the forum from Iceland. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken urged other council members to oppose Moscow's attempts to control Arctic shipping as climate change opens up new routes, and voiced concern over Russia's military build-up. Russia criticized NATO's activities in the region. The military activity in the Arctic poses an increasing risk, says Katerina Kurtisova with the European Leadership Network.
In the absence of military-to-military dialogue or an appropriate forum where such concerns could be discussed, the likelihood of miscalculation or misreading of intentions and accidental escalation is growing.
Russia says it wants to use its chairmanship to focus on sustainable development, protecting the indigenous communities in the Arctic, and on climate change. Scientists say the Arctic is warming twice as fast as other regions, with dramatic effects. Fires ripped across Siberia amid a summer heatwave in 2020. Melting permafrost was blamed for a huge oil leak in the Russian Arctic.
Russia acknowledges that there is a problem, but it really focuses its efforts on the adaptation side, adapting to the impacts, physical impacts of climate change, rather than mitigating strategies that would address their causes.
On the sidelines of the summit Wednesday, Secretary Blinken held a bilateral meeting with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. He said the United States seeks a stable relationship with Russia, but it would respond if, in his words, Russia acts aggressively against us, our partners, or our allies.
But having said that, there are many areas where our interests intersect and overlap, and we believe that we can work together and indeed build on those interests, whether it is dealing with COVID-19 and the pandemic, combating climate change, dealing with the nuclear programs in Iran and North Korea, Afghanistan. There are many areas of intersecting interests.
Lavrov offered this response.
We are ready to discuss all the issues without exception, but under perception that the discussion will be honest, with the facts on the table, and of course on the basis of mutual respect.
That discussion could take place at the highest level, with a summit between US President Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin proposed in the coming weeks. There has yet to be any official confirmation. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
We will now take the family photo for the 2021 NATO summit.
A totally natural photo shoot for the 30 NATO leaders, physically distancing. And their summit Monday in Brussels, putting a couple of countries in sharp focus, China and Russia.
Our relationship with Russia is at its lowest point since the Cold War. China is rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal with more warheads and a larger number of sophisticated delivery systems.
Tough talk from NATO Secretary General at the summit, where alliance leaders declared China a global security challenge with concerning coercive policies.
It's great to see you, Prime Minister Trudeau.
Justin Trudeau calling for a firm stance against Russia and the rise of authoritarianism around the world.
There's also a realignment around the world in geopolitics that is something that should be of concern to everyone.
U.S. President Joe Biden urging a strong, united NATO front against Moscow's aggression and Beijing's military muscle, while offering his nation's support to the Western alliance.
I want to make it clear, NATO is critically important for U.S. interest in and of itself.
That's in stark contrast to former U.S. President Donald Trump's belittling of the group, dismissing it as obsolete. Looking ahead to Wednesday in Geneva, where Biden will hold his first summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Plenty to talk about with friction over hacking, election meddling, and Ukraine and more. Biden expected to hold a solo news conference after the meeting, unlike Trump's side-by-side appearance with Putin. Just another attempt to distance himself from his predecessor. On Sunday at the wrap-up of the G7, Biden declaring,
I felt a genuine sense of enthusiasm that America was back at the table.
Melissa Duggan, City News.
President Joe Biden says the United States will respond in a robust and meaningful way if Russia engages in harmful activities. He arrived in the United Kingdom on his first international visit since assuming the office in January.
Addressing U.S. troops in Britain, Biden said Washington does not see conflict with Russia. He reiterated Washington's desire for a stable and predictable relationship with Moscow. Meanwhile, the U.S. president also hailed his country's unwavering commitment to the NATO alliance, but stressed that the alliance needs to modernize and expand its cyber capabilities to meet challenges. During the 8-day trip, Biden seeks to rebuild transatlantic ties strained during the Trump era and to reframe relations with Russia.
At every point along the way, we're going to make it clear that the United States is back and democracies of the world are standing together to tackle the toughest challenges and the issues that matter most to our future. That we're committed to leading with strength, defending our values, and delivering for our people.
Biden will meet Russian President Vladimir Putin next week after separate summits with NATO, G7 and European leaders.
Two great powers face to face.
President Biden wants U.S.-Russia relations to be predictable again.
Его ответ отличался от ответа господина Трампа.
Russian and Chinese joint military exercises.
Those two countries threaten the security of the North Atlantic area.
It's clearly not in anybody's interest for us to be in a new Cold War.
President Biden wants to calm things down.
This is not a kumbaya moment, as they used to say back in the 60s in the United States, like, let's hug and love each other. But it's clearly not in anybody's interest for us to be in a situation where we're in a new Cold War.
Президент Байден человек очень опытный. Это совершенно очевидно. Мы с ним с глазу на глаз ответа господина Трампа.
In recent years, the Russians and Chinese have conducted joint military exercises, not just here in Russia, but in the Mediterranean too.
Those two countries, more than any other countries in the world, challenge or threaten the security of the North Atlantic area, which is what NATO exists to defend.
NATO's dilemma in dealing with both these autocrats is how to challenge and trade with them at the same time.
Russia and China are both seeking to drive a wedge in our transatlantic solidarity.
Relations between NATO and Russia, between the United States and Russia, are the worst since the end of the Cold War. We don't want them to get any worse than that because of the dangers in the nuclear age that represents. So at the very least, let's talk to Russia. Let's have a dialogue.
President Biden turned the page on 4 years of chaos and humiliation for the United States under former President Trump.
These were talks about talks. There really were no deliverables. Putin came away from this pretty well.
Vladimir Putin headed to the summit knowing that his power derives from disrupting the international order, annexing part of a neighboring state, poisoning his enemies, cyber warfare.
Если Россия враг, то какие организации будет поддерживать Америка в России? Я думаю, что не те, которые укрепляют Российскую Федерацию.
There's no love lost between the leaders.
I made it clear that we will not tolerate attempts to violate our democratic sovereignty or destabilize our democratic elections, and we would respond.
Officials will continue to work on major issues. The hope is that history will not repeat itself. President Biden wants US-Russia relations to be predictable again.
Желаем успехов в совместном учении. Возглавлять рожденный майор Юрий Ханов.